Hello everyone, and welcome to this series of videos focusing on analysing classic catalogues by classic artists. Like many others, I enjoy watching top 10 or worst to best artist countdowns by a wide variety of YouTube and internet reviewers, and it's always noticeable how common it is for reviewers, I guess quite understandably, to preface their countdowns with a purely personal preference disclaimer and suggesting that viewers compile and present their own versions rather than complaining in the comments section. So this got me to thinking as to how big a challenge it would be to try and bring an objective view to a wholly subjective art form, using data to turn art into science, essentially trying to make the subjective objective. So how do I make it objective? Well, one analogy might be for any of you that have studied at university or college, where your individual module assessments are subjectively marked by academics, but then subsequently fed through an algorithm to objectively identify your degree classification. So we could describe this as taking the collection of subjective individual reviews and taking each catalogue through its classification process. And we can also see how a form of objectivity naturally starts to emerge through a process of common consensus, which is why aggregated data can be quite revealing. So each video will focus on an individual artist or band, count down their aggregated top 10, then use data and analysis to see if any objective conclusions can be drawn on the strength, depth and variety of their entire studio catalogue. And once we've analysed artists individually, we can draw the series to a close by conducting comparative analysis of patterns and trends across all the artists featured. So who's eligible? Well, as it says here, only established artists with extensive and well recognised album catalogues need apply. So essentially artists that have reputations that are sufficient to generate a broad range of individual user countdown lists. And the series is not necessarily restricted to the artists that you see here, but these are examples of the kinds of artists that are likely to feature in this series. But it's also a good point really to focus on the reasons why certain artists are not deemed eligible. So because a minimum of 10 studio albums are required to present the top 10 countdown, with 8, at a push 9 albums, I'm sorry, but there's no place for Led Zeppelin. Nor for a band like Queen, who I would argue are primarily defined by their hits rather than their albums, so no entry. And I'm also going to say not for the Beach Boys, who I'm minded to shy away from on the basis that I think it's maybe just a bit too obvious what the #1 album would be. So on that basis, no entry. So although I'm quite comfortable with my position on Led Zeppelin and Queen, I appreciate I'm maybe taking a bit more of a risk with my Beach Boys position, so I am open to persuasion here. So just before we get to the interesting part of the video, I'll just do a quick run through of the criteria and methodology used for this exercise. So in common with the approach that's generally consistent amongst reviewers, we're looking at studio catalogues only. So what's out? Well, no live albums, no greatest hits, no best ofs, no outtakes or side projects. But what's in? Well, covers albums are included, as are soundtrack albums where the artist has written and recorded the full album. The sample is taken from up to a maximum of 20 reviews across YouTube and the internet, which is enough sample data to allow aggregation to establish clear trends. In terms of scoring, there's a straightforward descending order point scoring process for top 10 albums, which is then aggregated for full discography ranking and data pattern analysis. Some reviews may not include very recent output from those artists still very active, e.g. Dylan, Young, Springsteen, which may have a small impact on overall discography rankings, but I'm confident it would not impact overall top 10 placings. So today we're focusing on the top 10 countdown and deep data dive into Bob Dylan's extensive 39 album studio catalogue. Before we start, I just want to reiterate the objective nature of this exercise. So this is not really about my personal opinions, although I am a music fan, so I'm sure the odd insight and opinion might well sneak in. And finally, just before we dive in, just to confirm, this analysis has been compiled from the reviewers listed here. So if you can see your name or pseudonym here, a big thank you to you. This countdown and analysis is only possible due to the time you've taken to post individual reviews. Okay, let's do it. So at number 10, with a critic rating of 17%, we have John Wesley Harding. So this is Dylan's 1967 album, which really signalled the first change of direction from his trilogy of mid-60s electric albums. And despite the low-key release, the album still reached number 2 on the Billboard chart and number 1 on the UK chart. So at number 9, with a critic rating of 20%, we have Street Legal. 1978 album that received lukewarm reviews and a decline in sales on its release, but it has clearly held up well over time. And it could be argued that this and the follow-up release, Slow Train Coming, signalled a final burst of late 70s quality before the following decade of creative hiatus. At number 8, with a critic rating of 21%, we have Time Out of Mind. So despite a broadly positive response to Oh Mercy in 1989, this is really the album that's generally recognised as his comeback album. It kick-started a bit of an intermittent late career renaissance. Quite heavy on atmospheric blues and lyrically reminiscent of Blood on the Tracks, it's clearly a favourite with the fans, although he does generally sound a bit knackered on it, mind you. At number 7, with a critic rating of 29%, we have the freewheeling Bob Dylan. So this is Dylan's second album, released in 1963, and possibly one of his most iconic album covers. And this sees Dylan really hitting his stride as a songwriter, and it contains some of his most famous compositions, like Blowing in the Wind and A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall. And at number 6, with a critic rating of 36%, we have Nashville Skyline. So Bob tries his hand at a spot of country crooning and clearly does a very good job. An album that might be the very definition of short but sweet, but it paved the way for the country rock genre, as if he wasn't already influential enough. Lay Lady Lay is the track from the album that broke out into the wider public consciousness and actually features a cameo from Chris Christopherson, who performed the pivotal role of holding the bongos for drummer Kenny Buttrey to hit. At number 5, with a critic rating of 38%, we have Hurricane. So this is the follow-up to Blood on the Tracks, and another of his albums that wasn't universally acclaimed at the time, but has aged well with the Dylan community, who clearly regard it as one of his best albums. So this album contains Hurricane, which is actually one of Dylan's most streamed songs, and it's a song, along with Joey, which is also on the album, and not for the first time, in which Dylan opts for some sympathetic portrayals of controversial outlaw figures. At number 4, with a critic rating of 54%, we have Bringing It All Back Home. So the moment where Dylan goes full rock and roll, at least for half an album anyway. Absolutely packed with Dylan classics, and the point at which he starts to define himself as rock music's preeminent poet. It really does say something when an album of this quality and influence can only achieve the number 4 position on this countdown. So into the top 3, and at number 3, with a critic rating of 68%, we have Highway 61 Revisited. So this was the second of his electric trilogy, and a remarkable collection of songs considering it was recorded only a few months after Bringing It All Back Home. Like a Rolling Stone is probably his most celebrated song, and was certainly a watershed moment in the history of rock and roll. Also, hard to imagine anyone looking cooler than Dylan does on the cover of this album. At number 2, with a critic rating of 76%, we have Blonde on Blonde. So the final album from his mid-60s electric trilogy, and deemed to be the best amongst the pool of critics here. Contains too many classic songs to mention here, but in Dylan's own words is the album that came closest to the thin Wild Mercury sound he had in his head. So essentially Dylan at his most Dylan. Quite an impressive achievement for a double album to place so highly on the critic list, so this clearly closed off a highly creative period in his career. And of course, by being so highly ranked in this list, it automatically makes it one of the greatest albums of all time. And so to Dylan's #1 album. I think you all know what it is by now, but with a critic rating of 87%, we have Blood on the Tracks. So despite the influential genius of his mid-60s electric trilogy, it's Blood on the Tracks that endures above all others with the Dylan community. Generally described as his breakup album, it's possible this universally relatable theme helps it to connect so well with its listeners. Another example of an album that wasn't universally well received in its release, but which has continually grown in stature over time. Not as influential as some of the other albums covered in this countdown, but it clearly comes out as his best. So that's the top 10 countdown. So now let's have a deeper dive into the full catalogue data to see what trends and patterns emerge. And as part of this, I'll also attempt to nominate individual albums against a few key categories. So you can see here the full data table for Dylan's discography. If you're interested in the detail, of course, you can pause and pore over it if you're thus inclined. But let's look at some of the key metrics that can maybe start to shed some insight into the strength and depth of his catalogue. So starting with the #1 album, you can see here a clear victory for Blood on the Tracks, particularly in the face of some obviously very strong competition. So a high value here could be an indicator of relative weakness across the rest of the catalogue. So a low value is the best indicator of catalogue strength. So here's Blood on the Tracks coming in with 45% of reviewers ranking it as their #1 album. So a number of different albums rated at #1. So with 5 different albums nominated, this is a strong indicator of a collection of albums deemed significantly superior to the rest of his catalogue. I think the higher the number here, the better, although it's the percentage value that provides the relative insight. So you can see here a total of just under 13% of his studio catalogue was nominated by at least one reviewer as his #1 album. So the difference in percentage terms between the #1 and #2 albums, I think in some ways this is a less revealing statistic, but one that simply reveals the strength of affection for the #1 album. So the highest placed album without a top spot ranking, so you can see here it's Nashville Skyline, which came in at #6. So this is the album that's clearly highly regarded without ever fully hitting the sweet spot. A high placing could be another indicator of catalogue strength. So the largest number of placings without reaching the overall top 10. So you can see there's a tie here between Times They Are A-Changing and Oh Mercy, both of which were nominated 8 times without reaching the top 10. So you would describe this as the good but not great award. Albums that are quite well liked, but generally in the low reaches of the top 10 when they are nominated. So the number of albums to receive top 10 placings by every reviewer. So just the one, in this case, Blood on the Tracks, was the only album nominated by every single reviewer. So really the fewer albums in this category, the greater the indication of a wide appeal across the catalogue. So a low number here would be an indicator of catalogue strength. So Dylan coming in quite low with just the one album there. Rating spread between 10 and 1, so there's a 70% difference between Blood on the Tracks at #1 and John Wesley Harding at #10. So this is an indicator of the strength of the top 10 albums against each other. So a lower percentage spread would probably indicate greater catalogue strength. So there's a 70% spread between #1 and #10. Percentage of available ranking slots occupied by the top 10. So of all the votes cast, the top 10 are responsible or take 70.5% of every single vote cast. So again, this is really an indicator of the strength of the top 10 against the rest of the catalogue. So you would expect the value to be quite high no matter which artist we look at in this category, but a slightly lower percentage is potentially another indicator of catalogue strength, having a kind of longer tail with with popular albums further down the catalogue list. So albums failing to score a single point. So we have 12 of Dylan's albums, which translates as just under 31% of his studio catalogue. So it doesn't matter who the artist is, all great catalogues have got their stinkers, and these are Dylan's. You could be kinder and deem these to be the albums that just aren't as well liked as others, but here a low percentage value would be an indicator of strength. So the fewer albums that fail to score a single point indicates that those that do score points, there's a slightly better strength and depth in the catalogue. So just under 31%, so it'll be interesting to see how that compares against other artists. So some of these are quite neutral categories, not really easily comparable against other artists. So we just remove those, and then we're left with the categories, or those which start to have more value when you compare them against other artists. So we've looked at David Bowie already, so now we've got Dylan. So it'll be interesting to see the patterns that emerge as we build up our catalogue of artists. So let's look at some trend lines for Dylan's discography, starting first with this graph ranked by total points awarded. So the key thing here is to really look for the way in which the line trends downwards. Does it follow a fairly smooth, gradual path which would indicate votes split more evenly across the catalogue and therefore an indication of strength and depth? Or do we see something different, a quite steep, precipitous drop from those albums ranked at the top, followed by a long tail which indicates much more clustered voting, which in turn indicates the remainder of the catalogue struggling to match the very best albums. And as we can see here, Dylan's catalogue really falls closer to that latter category of the precipitous drop and the long tail. So now let's look at the trend line for Dylan's discography in chronological order, which gives a good indication of an artist's peak and troughs across their career. So firstly, we can see there's the expected mid-60s electric period peak, which is then followed by a bit of a mid-70s revival. A few well-regarded albums there, a little bit of an outlier there with the Basement Tapes, which was released in the mid-70s and just kind of brings that graph line down a bit. But yeah, certainly another creative period for Dylan. Then we have the well-documented 80s nadir, and then finally a bit of a late career renaissance during the noughties. So now I'm going to attempt to nominate an album against each of the categories listed here. So starting with Dylan's most overrated album, so I'm going to suggest Modern Times. So this is an album which received almost overwhelmingly positive reviews on its release, and was actually his first Billboard #1 album for 30 years. So the fact it only sits equal 16th on this countdown perhaps confirms that there's maybe some unconscious bias at play with critics who are desperate for indications of some kind of late career renaissance. It does come across as a bit generic blues, has some traces of Cocktail Lounge in it, and I would say generally it is a bit underwhelming. So moving on to his most underrated album, I'm going to suggest Street Legal. So this is an album that wasn't really particularly well received on its release, and it doesn't generally receive much attention in retrospective analysis of Dylan's catalogue, but it's clearly held up well over time and quite easily makes the top 10 here. And finally, his most divisive album, I'm going to suggest Love and Theft. So this is the second of his trio of, let's call them Renaissance albums. It's only just outside the top 10, but it only has half the number of critic nominations of the albums immediately above and below it, which means it's clearly very, very highly regarded by a few, but not especially so by the majority. So yeah, I shall nominate that as his most divisive album. So that completes my attempt to objectively review Bob Dylan's catalogue. It's still early days with a lot of analysis still to complete, but there's maybe some early evidence of the challenge there is to maintain a high level of quality across a very large studio catalogue. Like all art forms, music is highly subjective, so we like what we like and that's all that matters at the end of the day, but I hope you found this interesting nonetheless. Up next, it's Beatles time. Although they have a catalogue size that barely breaches the minimum threshold, it would clearly be patently ridiculous to conduct an exercise like this and not include the Beatles. So join me next time for a deep dive into their UK catalogue. In the meantime, thank you for watching.